French President Macron gave an armed forces New Year's message in Cesson-Savigne in western France at the Army Digital and Cyber Support Command. Like so much in current geopolitics, the election in the US and the return of President Donald Trump has caused a paradigm shift in Europe over defense spending and the Ukraine question, much of it as he predicted in 2018. NATO leaders denounced President Trump in 2018 and had much hand-wringing at the thought of him returning as president in 2024. But reality is setting in that the course of the Ukraine war and European defense will have to change. President Macron has emerged as a new champion in Europe for President Trump's efforts to reshape Ukraine war policy and European defense. However, what exactly is President Macron advocating and how can he achieve this? President Macron called this opportunity at his New Year's address an opportunity for a European strategic wake-up call, which is something he has advocated and has become more pronounced since late 2023. President Macron invited President-elect Trump to the Notre Dame Cathedral reopening in Paris in November 2024, and then held talks with Mr. Trump and was later joined by President Zelensky of Ukraine to have private meetings to discuss the Ukraine war and the expected US strategy to end the war. The meeting ended with positive signs as President Macron flew to Warsaw, Poland, to discuss the plans with Polish President Donald Tusk in December 2024. The opportunity that President Macron is interested in is to embrace President Trump's desire to have Europeans take on a greater burden for their own defense. And he made the point at his address when he stated, "What would Europe do if the US withdrew its warships from the Mediterranean Sea or its air force from Europe to the Pacific?" His point was that Europe should not rely on America for its own defense, especially with the US expected to carry the Western burden of facing off against China in the Western Pacific. Europe, NATO, and the European Union have a vested interest in an effective US challenge to China. President Macron is trying to smooth over European fears that the US will withdraw from NATO, which President Macron is not saying will happen, but that the US will put less focus on European defense due to obligations elsewhere. Mr. Macron is urging Europe to assume responsibility for its own defense and not rely solely on the US. While President Macron and President Trump may not agree on many issues, in this particular case, the interests of the United States and France coincide. The US is looking at reducing its defense costs in Europe and continuing its shift to Asia, and France wants to see a decline in US influence in European defense matters. Before any of this can happen, President Trump and President Macron must agree that the war in Ukraine must reach some sort of peace agreement. Europe alone cannot support the Ukraine military's needs to continue the war, so it needs to end the war and Ukraine's reliance on a high preponderance of US weaponry. This is not to say Europe is not supporting the war effort and is providing economic support for Ukraine. It just lacks the defense production capacity to produce the weapons needed for the war. This is not an issue alone for Europe, as the US is also experiencing some production constraints in most defense productions, a near crisis in shipbuilding. President Macron earlier this month delivered a New Year's address on wide-ranging topics, and it included the need to end the Ukraine war on the proposed US Land for Security format that was discussed in Paris between the three leaders. Mr. Macron stated that the US should have the freedom to negotiate with Russia, to get them to agree to peace talks, and that Europe would provide security for Ukraine, which does not include NATO membership. France, the United Kingdom, Germany, and Poland have all been in discussions about providing peacekeepers inside Ukraine to be a buffer between Ukraine and Russia. This would be outside of NATO, and if Russia attacked these peacekeepers, it would not bring in NATO and Article 5, but would most likely lead to a shooting war between Russia and the most powerful European nations and their allies, and it would most certainly involve the US at some point, as US vital interests still include Europe. This is unstated and de facto security for Ukraine until a more permanent solution can be created. Mr. Macron has also suggested that part of the security arrangements would include the development of a Ukraine defense industry that could serve Ukraine's defense needs but also Europe, thus providing Ukraine with a new industry and a customer base that will be called in to spend more on its own defense. Mr. Macron wants a European weapons industry that is not reliant on the US either, so a European defense industrial base expansion serves the French vision. Also, increasing the supply side of defense production should put downward price pressure on defense procurement and allow increased defense spending to go further, or at least not have defense spending increases diluted by price pressure due to increased demand. Mr. Macron also needs to persuade European leaders to commit a substantial number of peacekeepers for an extended period, which would act as a genuine deterrent against future Russian aggression. He must also temper the expectations of the Ukrainians, who have apparently reserved their approval for such a peace plan, but President Zelensky has added an additional demand that such a peacekeeping force needs to be 200,000 troops at a minimum to deter Russia. The UK, France, Germany and Poland only have a combined land force of about 400,000 soldiers, so the 200,000 peacekeepers are unrealistic, and it is unclear how this number was ascertained. For example, a challenge is that the British Army only has 74,000 soldiers, and Prime Minister Keir Starmer has not committed to the idea, but is only able to field 5,000 to 10,000 soldiers for a Ukrainian mission outside of its RAF and Royal Navy operations in the Black Sea. Another challenge is the Bundeswehr is also struggling with manpower and equipment, and is struggling to meet its obligation to deploy 5,000 soldiers for an armoured brigade in Lithuania. So it is doubtful they can support much more in Ukraine, without a significant increase in defence spending that won't be resolved until after the German federal elections in February. Although they have different motivations, President Macron and President Trump share similar goals for long-term European security. The obstacle to reaching this new security concept is the end of the Ukraine war in the formula that is being discussed. A peacekeeping force that is big enough to satisfy the Ukrainians is beyond the capability of European NATO and would most likely be rejected by the Russians as too many troops near its borders, if one wants to consider the current line of control as Russia's borders. A force too small will not satisfy the Ukrainians without a NATO membership or a pathway to get to membership in a short order. A tripwire concept of European troops could be a deterrent option, as attacking them would start a wider European war, but the soldiers would be sacrificed in the short term, and Ukraine would need to maintain a large standing army to back up the peacekeeping force. The opportunity for a strategic wake-up call has its first stop in Kiev before it can go any further.